Ember Witch. Book 1. The Lich. Volume 1. Black Tragedy. Chapter 1. The Blade in the Tree. April 5th to August 12th, 457 BME. Fragment 4. Goodbyes. The sun rose in the west, illuminating a town at the foothills of the Queen's Crown Mountains. The noise of humanity breaking the once silent night. Farron packed the last of his supplies onto his cart with regret. He had thought his retirement was certain, thought that he could settle down and raise his children. That dream died the moment a summons arrived at his home. Despite his years of service, he once again had to pack his bags and run off to the capital city to assist in the construction efforts. Meridia wasn't just the capital of the kingdom, but the largest construction project the world had ever known. Hundreds of miles worth of buildings had already taken shape, and yet the expansion was still ongoing. His architectural expertise had landed him a high-paying position within the kingdom, and with such a position came responsibility. He had no choice but to obey his king, not only because he was ordered to, but because his family relied upon the money. He turned to look at his family, hoping that his sadness wouldn't show through. The three women stood paces away and couldn't be more different in their attitudes towards his departure. His beautiful wife Eve stood tall, holding back her emotions. Her black dress and deep black hair, hidden under a large hood, were silhouetted against the rising sun. The metallic glint of her jeweled necklace a sign of her nervous habit as she rubbed the green gemstone between her fingers. Aries, his youngest daughter, stood at hip level next to her mother as she clutched the black silk in her hand. Only 10 years old, she stared at her father with tears streaming down her face. The cold morning air causing her cheeks to turn a bright red. She was the spitting image of him down to the blonde hair and blue eyes they both shared. His oldest daughter Lilith, on the other hand, stood off to the side as she stared at the ground with clenched fists. Her hair, the same color as her mother's, giving her an almost twin-like quality at a glance.
"Don't go, Daddy. Please don't go,"
Aries choked out between sobs, which broke his heart even more. He moved with care as he knelt down and wrapped her in his arms.
"I love you so much. I don't want to go, but I must, my angel. Can you make me a promise?"
Aries nodded her head as she cried into his shoulder.
"Can you be strong for me? After all, who's going to protect Mommy and Lily while I'm away?"
"I promise,"
Aries replied through her tears as he kissed her on the forehead. Standing up, he looked to Eve with a deep longing. His eyes stinging as a few tears escaped his steadily declining strength.
"I will return as soon as I can."
"Then just go already,"
Lilith interrupted with a rage he was expecting to hear from his 15-year-old daughter. Turning away from Eve with a small smirk, he set his eyes on Lilith. Her anger was well apparent as she breathed heavily.
"My sweet Lily, I hate having to leave you again,"
he said, reaching his hand to her cheek to wipe away a tear. Despite their close proximity, Lilith could barely even look at him. Her eyes wavered from him, looking back down to the ground as more tears welled with every second.
"Lilith, my sweet precious flower, I am always here, right here in your heart,"
Farron said, pulling his hand from her face. He leaned forward and kissed her on the forehead, then turned back to Eve, knowing that Lilith, even in her anger, would be strong enough to forgive him one day.
"I love you, Eve, you have made my world complete. I don't care if the king needs another 100 towers or walls, I will return to you, I promise,"
he said, grabbing her hand and holding it tight. Eve, now on the verge of sobbing, wrapped her arms around him.
"I love you too, you are my heart and soul,"
she replied as they held each other for some time. After a couple of minutes they kissed, allowing their last moments together to be filled with love and passion. As Farron started to move back, Eve held fast, not wanting to let go. Farron's hand began to slip from her grip, and she knew this was their final moments together. She wiped away a tear from her eye, then grabbed the green jewel hanging from her necklace and rubbed it with her thumb. The jewel shined a slight glint as she did, and she began to regain her composure. She grabbed Aries' hand as the small girl started to move after her father. Farron walked back to the cart, climbed onto the seat and grabbed the reins.
I will return as soon as I can, I promise,
he said as he looked back at his family. Snapping the reins, Farron said one last goodbye as the small horse began the long journey south. Lilith watched with pain and grief in her eyes as her father disappeared once again, leaving her on her birthday. She turned her back on her mother and sister, then began walking towards the woods to be alone. Hours passed as she vented her pain through her tears, but she knew that she had to go home soon. Taking a deep breath, she calmed herself and made the trip back home. Aries was in the small room her and her sister shared, playing with a small wooden toy made to resemble a bird. She was making whooshing noises, pretending it was flying and holding it above her head, moving up and down. She swooped it down and made a crashing noise as it hit the ground, and she laughed in excitement. She was easily entertained by things hitting the ground, as her father often dropped things. Eve walked into the room and smiled. She looked at her daughter playing with a toy bird and giggled.
You like the birdies, don't you?
she asked the child sitting on the floor.
Of course, Mama, I want to fly just like them when I get older,
Aries replied, smiling up at her mother.
You would make a great bird, wouldn't you?
Eve replied, kneeling down and picking Aries up. Holding her up in the air, she began to walk around the room, letting Aries make the whooshing noises as she pretended she was a bird flying high in the sky. Lilith walked to the front door, sighed and opened it to see her mother and sister playing bird. She smiled and closed the door.
Oh, look who's here, sweetie,
Eve said, flying Aries over to Lilith.
Lily.
Aries yelled out, putting her arms out towards her sister.
Come here, you little birdie,
she said, grabbing Aries from Eve and embracing her in a hug. Aries began to laugh and cuddle up in Lilith's arms. Lilith kissed her forehead, then put Aries down.
You silly bird,
Lilith said, poking Aries on the nose, then smiled.
How was your walk, sweetie?
Eve asked, smiling at her two children.
It was good, just skipped a few rocks and found a new boulder to sit on while I look up at the clouds,
Lilith said, not wanting to show she was upset. Eve stepped towards Lilith and embraced her in a hug.
That's good,
Eve replied, stroking Lilith's hair.
Tell me, what would you like for your birthday?
I want a new book,
Lilith replied after thinking about it for a bit.
A book?
Eve asked quizzically.
I think we can get you more than that, like maybe 2 books?
Eve asked, grinning and gesturing towards the table in the middle of the room.
You didn't?
Lilith said, excitedly rushing over to the table, seeing a rectangular-shaped block covered in a brown leather wrapping. Lilith grabbed the small string holding the wrapping together and tore it off, letting it and the wrapping fall to the ground. In her hand, she held 2 books, each the same size, stacked on top of each other. She lifted the worn-out cover and began to read the first page of the top book.
Mom, you're the best. These are the last books I needed to complete my collection,
Lilith exclaimed excitedly.
They were not easy to find, I assure you.
Thank you so much, Mum.
Now you enjoy those while I finish dinner, okay?
Eve said, walking up to the small pot of stew that had been above the fire for the last 10 minutes. Lilith nodded, finding a seat, all while not even looking up from the pages. They ate dinner while talking about the new books and how the stories kept getting better and better with each new chapter she had read. They had a small pastry plate for dessert, then headed off to bed. Eve tucked her children in, kissed them goodnight and went into her room to sleep. Lilith, however, wasn't tired, so she kept a candle lit and kept reading while her sister drifted off to sleep. After a few hours, Lilith fell asleep, book in hand.